Hello and welcome to Faux News. I'm your host, Faux Hughes. Today is 3.5 years to the day since Russia invaded Ukraine, and yet the war continues to drag on. Where do things stand? How did we get here? Let's take a look at it. In short, the West continues to engage itself in forever wars. The roots of the Russia-Ukraine war go back to November of 2013 when protests erupted in Ukraine in response to the president's refusal to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. This was an agreement that sought closer ties with the EU, primarily economically, and it had been overwhelmingly passed by Parliament. Protests and tensions continued in Ukraine from November 2013 throughout the winter of 2014. At the end of February 2014, the president, Viktor Yanukovych, fled the country and a new government was installed. Russia was not happy with this result and annexed the Crimea. A month after Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014, Russian-backed separatists and paramilitary organizations succeeded in taking control of the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. After Russia took control of the Donbas in 2014, there were continued fighting and skirmishes between various factions and militias. However, things remained in a relative stasis until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022.
Yeah, it is because of the assault that's going on there by the Russians. I talked to somebody on the ground in Kyiv a couple of hours ago, and they said that at least right now, the Ukrainian lines are holding here around the capital. We'll get to that in a minute, but you can see just how much progress the Russians have made on a number of fronts. They've almost closed in all the way around.
Those in the Kremlin and also in Belarus, from which Russia launched a large part of its invasion of Ukraine, thought that Kyiv would fall within days and that this would be a cakewalk for the Russian military. It has turned out not to be that way. While they did get within 20 miles of Kyiv at one point, the Ukrainians were able to fight them back and reclaim much of the territory that was lost in the first several weeks of the invasion. Ukraine launched their first counteroffensive in the fall of 2022 and it was successful in reclaiming much of the territory lost in the south and the east. In August 2024, Ukraine launched a daring offensive into Russia. They went into the Kursk region, which is over the border from eastern Ukraine. They maintained control of this area until they were finally expelled in April 2025. With Donald Trump coming to office in January 2025, many were unsure about the prospect of continued U.S. support for Ukraine, with many hiccups along the way, including the infamous Oval Office debacle between President Zelensky and President Trump. The U.S. has continued to stand by Ukraine and leading into the events of this summer. On June 1st of this year, Ukraine launched its famous Operation Spiderweb, which used drones to attack several key airfields deep within Russia. Russia proceeded to increase its missile attacks on Ukraine, many of them hitting residential areas. It also moved forward on positions in southeastern Ukraine, recapturing much of the area in Luhansk and Donetsk. These increases in missile and drone exchanges between Ukraine and Russia, as well as the recapturing of territory by Russian forces, laid the backdrop for the peace talks, the summit that was held in Alaska between President Putin and President Trump on August 15th. The following Monday, August 18th, President Zelensky and major European leaders met with President Trump in Washington. The overall atmosphere and sentiment seems to be that Russia has broken through in some respects and that Ukraine is hanging on by a thread. There is also a general consensus that this war must come to an end. Russia, meanwhile, seems intent to continue to play the numbers game and throw everything they have into achieving their aims in Ukraine. On Friday, President Trump made a 2 week deadline decree. 4 days prior was his meeting with the European heads of state and President Zelensky. His latest 2 week notice decree is that President Putin and President Zelensky have to meet. He wants them initially to meet just amongst themselves and then follow that up with a trilateral meeting in which he is included. If they cannot reach an agreement to meet, President Trump has said that in 2 weeks' time he will decide his next moves and he will base them on who he believes is at fault for the meeting not taking place if it does not. It seems that Russia is not going to be on board with this, given the language coming out of Moscow and also comments from Sergei Lavrov. So we will see if this occurs, but it's looking unlikely at this point. One very interesting development that is flying a bit under the news radar is that last Thursday, the day before Trump made his 2 week deadline announcement, an individual, a Ukrainian, was arrested in Italy and handed over to German authorities, who is being accused as the mastermind of the Nord Stream attacks. The Nord Stream attacks were an act of sabotage in September 2022 against Russian natural gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, and it has been an international mystery in the years since who was responsible for them. Both Russia, Germany, Ukraine, all of the major actors have denied responsibility, and it's very interesting that suddenly now, on the eve of these big talks and summits, a suspect has been identified and arrested. As we stand by to see if President Putin and President Zelensky are going to meet and if that meeting will produce any positive outcomes, it is time to take stock of the situation. I think this conflict has reached a tipping point, an impasse, in that the relative stalemate that has persisted for years is not going to be allowed to continue by either side. I think both sides stand poised to make some definitive and big moves to try and bring this conflict to a complete resolution. That said, my personal feelings on the matter uh, are lengthy. I think that this is just another example of the West's inability to effectively wage war post World War II. There's a great book on this topic called Why America Loses Wars by Donald Stoker. I highly recommend it. It talks about the politicization of warfare in the West, primarily in regard to that book in the US post World War II, and how it greatly curtails the ability to effectively wage war. We're talking about things like being in Afghanistan and having to get on your SATCOM and have things go through a judicial team to decide whether or not you could strike a target before you do or not. You simply cannot wage war like that, and you will be continually engaged in forever wars that you can't bring a resolution to, as we have seen time after time after time in the previous decades with the US and the West in general. I think this conflict has reached a point where, certainly by now, if not even years prior, you cannot continue to give the hot air remarks that we stand by Ukraine, we will not tolerate this Russian aggression unless you're willing to put your own people into Ukraine and actually counteroffensively invade Russia to make them have to focus on their own losses and not just gaining more ground in Ukraine. If you're not willing to do that, I think you go home. You just lay it all down and you go home. This notion of continuing to send in billions of dollars of munitions and missiles and technology into Ukraine and then telling them what week they can use which missile and how far they can fire it pulling intelligence on a whim because you're unhappy with the decisions made by Zelensky or those in power. That's absurd. You can't wage war that way, especially not against a military juggernaut like Russia, who has the numbers advantage and will continually throw endless bodies into the conflict zone. I think part of why the US and the West have become so enamored with forever wars is because it's very good business. It keeps things at a threshold where public outrage does not reach too much of a tipping point to force you to disengage from the conflict, but it keeps you involved for years on years, which brings in munitions and all sorts of armaments and keeps the military industrial complex a roaring. So, to conclude, if the West wants to say genuinely that they stand with Ukraine and have Ukrainian flags at 10 Downing Street and all over the world, then you have to put your own skin in the game. You have to be willing to risk what could be on the table by putting foreign troops, i.e., not Ukrainian, into Ukraine and into Russia. You have to go all in. If you're not willing to do that and risk nuclear war, then you have to close up shop and say to Ukraine, we're sorry, but you're on your own. We've done all that we can. Russia takes this territory, then you're just going to have to live with it. That's a hard thing to say, which is why no one wants to say it because it takes a backbone to say that. And that's why this has dragged on for 3.5 years. But that's where this needs to go. In terms of the implications of the very far fetched idea of the West being willing to do that, i.e., nuclear war, I don't think Putin, as deranged and evil and underhanded as he is, I don't think that he is a full-on madman, and I don't think that he would go the nuclear route unless it was someone else went the nuclear route. Meaning, I think that you could invade Russia and that we would not have a nuclear war. That's a very audacious statement to make, and but I stand by that. And however, it's a big risk, and it's one that the West, I don't think, is willing to take, which is why this war needs to, um, the strings need to be cut because you're never going to win this war otherwise. Russia is just going to continue to throw numbers into the front and continue to try to wear Ukraine down further and further and further. I think this trying the strategy of hoping that Russia will give up, that the Russian public will become dissatisfied with the state of things, that has run its course long ago. We saw that with the Wagner mercenaries and the killing of their leader 2 years ago. If Putin was going to be deposed and public sentiment was going to turn against this war, that of the Russian public, to the point where they had to close up shop and leave Ukraine, I think that would have happened years ago, and it is clear at this point to me that it is not going to happen. To end on a positive note, hopefully this meeting between Zelensky and Putin comes to fruition and they are able to reach a peaceful resolution to this conflict. As said before, though, I think this looks doubtful, unfortunately. That is it for today's episode. Thank you for watching. It's not fake news, it's faux news.